The 401k is one of the most important financial institutions in American life. It holds trillions of dollars. It is where tens of millions of working Americans keep the money they are counting on to carry them through their old age. For most people with a workplace retirement plan today, the 401k is not a supplement to their retirement. It is their retirement, the single pillar their whole future rests upon. It sits at the very center of how a modern American grows old. So you would assume it was designed for that purpose. You would assume that at some point, thoughtful people in government and finance sat down, studied the problem of how a nation should provide for its citizens in old age, and deliberately engineered the 401k as the answer to a considered national policy, built on purpose to do the enormous job it now does. That assumption is wrong, and the truth is one of the strangest stories in the history of American money. Because nobody designed the 401k to be the backbone of American retirement. Nobody, in fact, designed it to be a retirement plan for ordinary workers at all. It was not the product of careful policy. It was very nearly an accident, the result of one clever man reading an obscure, almost invisible clause buried in a tax law. A clause written for something else entirely, and realizing he could bend it into a purpose no one had intended. The 401k that now governs the financial fate of a nation was, in its origins, a loophole, a tax quirk, a footnote in a piece of legislation about something else, spotted and repurposed by a benefits consultant who was simply trying to build a better savings plan for a client. It was meant at first to be a small thing, a modest bonus on top of the real retirement system. Instead, through a chain of accidents and incentives that no one planned and no one fully controlled, it grew and grew until it swallowed the very system it was meant to sit beside and became the thing itself. This is the story of how that happened, the true origin of the 401k. And it is a story that overturns the comfortable assumption that the foundation of American retirement was ever really designed at all. To see how an accident came to hold the future of a nation, you first have to understand the solid, deliberate system that quietly replaced the world of retirement as it existed before the loophole was found. For much of the 20th century, the way a great many Americans retired looked completely different from the way they retire now, and it rested on something called the pension specifically, what experts call a defined benefit pension. The idea behind it was simple, and from the worker's point of view, wonderfully reassuring. You went to work for a company, often for decades, and in exchange for your years of loyal service, the company made you a promise. When you retire, it would pay you a defined benefit, a fixed, guaranteed income, month after month for the rest of your life. The amount was worked out by a formula, usually based on your salary and how many years you had worked there. And then, until the day you died, the checks would come. You did not have to do anything. You did not have to save or invest or make any decisions. You simply worked, and the pension was waiting for you at the end, as steady as a sunrise. The crucial feature of this arrangement, the thing that mattered most, and that we have very nearly forgotten, is where the risk sat. In a defined benefit pension, the company bore the risk, not the worker. It was the company's job to set aside the money, to invest it, to manage it, and to make sure there was enough to keep its promises. If the investments did poorly, that was the company's problem to solve. The retiree still got the same guaranteed check. If a retiree lived to 100, That was the company's problem too. The checks kept coming regardless. The worker was insulated from the uncertainties of markets and lifespans. The burden of making retirement work was carried by the institution, not the individual. This system, combined with Social Security, the government's own guaranteed retirement income, formed the backbone of a secure old age for millions of Americans in the post-war decades. A worker with a good pension and Social Security could look forward to retirement with genuine confidence, knowing that two reliable streams of income would be there no matter what happened to the stock market or how long they lived. But the pension had one great weakness, and it was not a weakness for the worker. It was a weakness for the company. Guaranteeing a fixed income to thousands of former employees for the rest of their unpredictable lives is an enormous, open-ended, and expensive obligation. The company is on the hook forever, exposed to the whims of the markets and the stubborn tendency of retirees to keep living. For a business looking at its books, a pension is a heavy and permanent burden, a promise that stretches decades into the future and can only grow. Companies honored these promises because it was the norm, because unions fought for them, and because that was simply how things were done. What no one quite realized as the 1970s drew to a close was that a small change buried in the tax code was about to hand those companies a way out, an escape from the heavy burden of the pension, and that this escape hatch had been created entirely by accident, meant for something else altogether. In 1978, the United States Congress passed a large and unremarkable piece of tax legislation, the Revenue Act of that year. It was the kind of sprawling bill that adjusts 1,000 technical details of the tax system, and it passed without anyone imagining it would change how a nation retired. Tucked away inside, it was a new provision, a subsection of the Internal Revenue Code, numbered 401k. That number, a section and a subsection of the tax code, is where the whole thing gets its odd, bureaucratic name. Here is the part that matters most, and that almost no one remembers. Section 401k was not written to create a retirement plan for ordinary workers. That was not its purpose at all. It was a technical clarification, aimed at a narrow and rather dry problem in the tax treatment of what is called deferred compensation. The problem it addressed went like this. Companies sometimes gave employees the choice of taking part of their compensation, a bonus, say, or a share of profits either as cash now, or as a contribution set aside for later. These were known as cash or deferred arrangements, and a thorny tax question hung over them. If an employee chose to defer some of that money instead of taking the cash, should they be taxed on it right away, as if they had received it, or only later, when they actually got it? The uncertainty made these arrangements risky to use. Section 401k was written largely to settle that question, to lay out the rules under which such deferred amounts could avoid immediate taxation. It was, in other words, a piece of technical plumbing, meant to tidy up the tax status of profit sharing and bonus deferrals, arrangements that were often associated with better paid employees and executives. Read the intent plainly. The clause was about clarifying when deferred money gets taxed. It was not a grand vision of a new retirement system. It was not meant to replace pensions. It was not meant to turn tens of millions of ordinary workers into managers of their own investment accounts. It was a small, dry, technical fix, the sort of provision that tax lawyers note and everyone else ignores. When it became law, it attracted almost no attention. It was expected to affect a narrow set of arrangements at the margins of the compensation world. There is even an irony hiding in the legislative background. The rules around these cash or deferred arrangements were in part an effort to police them, to set conditions on a practice that had tended to benefit better-paid employees, and to make sure such tax-favored deferrals were not simply a shelter for the well-off. In other words, the clause that would go on to become the great mass savings plan of ordinary American workers had grown out of a rather technical wrangle over how to handle a perk more associated with the top of the pay scale. Its journey from a narrow provision about the highly compensated to the retirement account of the everyday worker was not planned by anyone. It just happened. And for a little while, that is roughly all the clause did. The provision sat there in the code, a quiet clarification about deferred pay. If nothing more had happened, the number 401k would today mean nothing to anyone but specialists, a forgotten cross-reference in the tax law. It would never have entered the language, never have become the thing every working American keeps their retirement in. But something more did happen, because a provision that lets people set aside part of their pay before it is taxed is a powerful thing if you look at it in the right light, and one man was about to look at it in exactly the right light and see in that dry little clause a possibility that its authors had never imagined. The man who changed everything was a benefits consultant named Ted Benna, and he has come to be called, fairly, the father of the 401k. Around 1980, Benna was doing what benefits consultants do, trying to design a good, tax-efficient savings plan, in his case, for a client. And as he worked, he found himself looking hard at that obscure new clause, Section 401k, and turning it over in his mind. What Benna saw was a possibility that the clause's authors had not intended, and perhaps not even noticed. The provision said that employees could choose to defer part of their compensation and avoid being taxed on it immediately. Everyone had read this narrowly, as a rule about bonuses and profit sharing. But Benna asked a bolder question. What if you applied it to an employee's regular salary? What if you set up a plan in which ordinary workers could choose to take a slice of their ordinary paycheck and, instead of receiving it as taxable cash, divert it before tax into a personal savings account that would grow untaxed until retirement? And what if the employer sweetened the deal by adding a matching contribution, putting in some money of its own for every dollar the worker set aside? Read that way, the dry little tax clause became something entirely new, a simple, powerful, tax-advantaged savings plan that any regular employee could use, funded straight out of their paycheck and boosted by their employer. It was an interpretation the provision technically allowed, but that no one had built out and put to work in this form. Benna designed exactly such a plan, and then he did the essential thing. He sought and won the blessing of the tax authorities, getting a favorable ruling that confirmed his creative reading was legitimate. He first put the idea into practice at his own firm, setting up one of the earliest plans of this modern kind and trying it on his own employees before the wider world had any inkling of what it would become. With that, in the early 1980s, the modern 401k as we know it was born. It is worth pausing on how fragile that moment was. This was a creative interpretation of a clause the government could, in principle, have decided to read the other way. Had the tax authorities ruled against Benna, had they said, no, this provision was never meant for regular salary deferral, the entire modern 401k might simply never have existed. The financial foundation of tens of millions of American retirements hung at the start on a single favorable ruling about the meaning of an obscure sentence. Notice what actually happened here, because that is the whole point. The 401k was not handed down by Congress as a designed retirement system. It was reverse engineered out of a tax loophole by a private consultant looking for a clever plan for a client. Its creation was an act of interpretation, not legislation, a bright idea about what an existing, unrelated clause could be made to do. The foundation of American retirement began not with a policy, but with a hunch. And here is the piece that the later history makes so painful. In Benna's conception, and in everyone's understanding at the start, this new plan was never meant to be the main event. It was meant to be a supplement. The traditional pension was still the real retirement system, the solid, guaranteed foundation. The 401k was imagined as a nice extra sitting on top of it, a way for workers to save a little more, with a tax break and an employer match, alongside the pension that would still do the heavy lifting. It was the cherry, not the cake. No one designing those first plans imagined that this modest supplement would one day be asked to carry the entire weight of a worker's retirement alone. But the incentives it created were about to make exactly that happen, and they would do it whether anyone intended it or not. The 401k spread with astonishing speed. Within just a few years of Benna's innovation, companies across America were racing to set up these plans, and the number of workers with 401ks exploded through the 1980s and beyond. On the surface, it looked like a happy story, a convenient new way to save, embraced by millions. But underneath, something far more consequential was happening. A quiet revolution that no one had voted for and no one had planned. Employers looked at the 401k and saw something its inventor had not intended them to see. They saw an escape hatch from the pension. Remember the great weakness of the traditional pension. It was a heavy, permanent, open-ended burden on the company, which bore all the risk and guaranteed the payouts. The 401k offered a way to shed that burden almost entirely. With a 401k, the company no longer had to promise anyone a fixed income for life. It no longer had to manage the investments or guarantee the results. All it had to do was match some of what the employee chose to save, and its obligation was finished. The moment the paycheck was deferred and the match was paid, the company was off the hook forever. For a business, the appeal was overwhelming. Why carry the enormous, risky, decades-long weight of a pension when you could offer a 401k instead, hand the whole job to the employee, and walk away? And so, over the following decades, that is precisely what happened, on a massive scale. Companies froze their pensions, closed them to new workers, and steered everyone toward the 401k instead. The solid, guaranteed, employer-borne pension went into a long decline, and the accidental supplement rose to take its place. The scale of the reversal is striking. Where a large share of private sector workers could once expect a traditional guaranteed pension, only a small fraction can today, while the 401k and its relatives have swollen to hold trillions of dollars for tens of millions of savers. In the span of a few decades, one system quietly gave way to another, and hardly anyone noticed it happening as a deliberate choice, because it never was one. The cherry became the cake. The thing that was meant to sit on top of the retirement system quietly devoured it and became the system. And in that transformation lies the part that the tidy story most gets wrong. and that matters most. When the 401k replaced the pension, it did not just change the paperwork. It reversed completely the question of who bears the risk. Under the old pension, the company carried the danger of bad markets and long lifespans, and the worker was guaranteed. Under the 401k, all of that risk was transferred onto the individual worker. Now it is you who must decide how much to save, you who must choose how to invest it, you who must weather every crash, and you who must make sure the money lasts as long as you live, with no guarantee that it will, and no one to catch you if it does not. The entire, enormous responsibility for making retirement work was moved off the institution and onto the shoulders of ordinary people, most of whom are not investment professionals and never asked for the job. Even Ted Benna, the man who found the loophole and built the first plan, came to look at what his creation had become with unease. In later years, he reflected that the system had grown into something he had not intended and could not fully approve of, that he had, in his own striking words, helped create a monster. He had meant to build a simple supplement to help people save a little more. He had not meant to build the fragile, individualized, risk-laden foundation on which the retirement of a nation would come to rest. So consider again the comfortable assumption we started with, that the 401k must have been carefully designed to be the backbone of American retirement. The truth is the opposite in every respect. It was not designed for the job at all. It was an accidental reading of an obscure tax clause written for something else, meant only as a modest extra that grew by unplanned incentive into the main pillar of a nation's old age, and in doing so, silently shifted the whole risk of growing old from powerful institutions onto individual workers. The most important thing to understand about the foundation of American retirement is that no one ever really built it as a foundation. It was a loophole that got out of hand. And tens of millions of people are now standing on it.